Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Veterans Voice, brought to you by the Oklahoma Department of Veterans Affairs. I'm your host, Krista Townsend, and today we're going to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Joining me today is Aaron Ashworth. He's the Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Programs Administrator for ODVA. Aaron is a licensed professional counselor, a chaplain in the Oklahoma Army National Guard, and currently a captain with 3 combat tours under his belt and more than 20 years of service in the Oklahoma National Guard. Aaron is also leading the Oklahoma Governor's Challenge to prevent suicide among service members, veterans, and their families, which is a huge undertaking. So I commend you for taking that challenge on, because that's a huge deal. So welcome, and thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kristen.
All right, so today, like I said, we're going to talk about PTSD, which is a common ailment among Oklahoma veterans. So let's just start with the basics. First of all, what is post-traumatic stress disorder?
So post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental health disorder that is often characterized by basically somebody who's experienced or witnessed a crisis or trauma event that has created symptoms of anything ranging from flashbacks, night terrors, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. So what are some of the common symptoms of PTSD?
Yeah, some of the common symptoms that you often see. So flashbacks, night terrors, so nightmares. A lot of times you'll see increased anxiety, increased depression or isolation. A lot of times you'll see aggressive behaviors, or just a lot of panickiness, a lot of fear. And I think it's just really kind of dependent on the individual. Like, you don't always experience all of them. You might just experience 1 or 2 of them. But there's a hypertension, basically, or a hyper awareness to your surroundings at all times. So you kind of always feel like you're on edge and always being leery of what's around the corner.
Right. Doesn't sound like a very pleasant place to be for very long.
No, it's very, very much driven by anxiety.
Yeah. So I'm assuming that probably a lot of veterans don't even know that they have PTSD sometimes, or people, or are they aware of it?
Yeah, I think today they're probably more aware of it than what they were 10 to even 15 years ago.
And they used to call it shell shock.
Yeah,
right?
They've had a variety of names for it throughout the years, but it's just recently that really post-traumatic stress has become apparent with we've been in war for 20 years. So now you're seeing a lot more episodes and a lot more research and studies that come back on what post-traumatic stress is. And there's a lot of people that will take the disorder off of it, because some people in the mental health world and otherwise feel like, it's not necessarily a disorder. There are ways to a lot of times overcome the panic attacks that you experience.
To mitigate the symptoms.
There's a lot of research being done around it right now, which is kind of neat and exciting all the same.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, people are talking about it a lot more, and maybe there's less stigma about it. And I mean, people can suffer from that aren't veterans, even, anybody that's had some type of traumatic event in their life. So it's just good that we're talking about it in general for everyone. So, okay, well, so what are some common triggers of PTSD that would set it off or increase the anxiety?
It can be really just about anything. So as we just came through the 4th of July, for some, loud explosions. It's interesting they label it as a mental health disorder. A lot of times what you'll see is that post-traumatic stress is really apparent through sensory components. So anything, touch, sight, sound, smell. So the 4th of July kind of encompasses all of those. So why the 4th is a struggle for a lot of people. You think about, well, they're hearing and seeing explosions. They smell gunpowder. They're in tight spaces with lots of people, so they feel crowded. So it's really playing to all of your senses, both sight, sound, smell, touch, taste, all the above, which is often where the triggers come from. So even outside of military, if you think about somebody that was sexually assaulted, and then they may be walking through a public area and someone breezes their shoulder the wrong way, and all of a sudden they get triggered by it. It's a lot of the same for the military as well. Like, it's the smallest thing. Sometimes it doesn't even require necessarily a trigger. You might just go to bed and start having night terrors and having dreams or flashbacks, and they can come without any awareness at all. Next thing you know, you're in the middle of having a post-traumatic stress moment and having to deal with that, trying to figure out ways to overcome it.
Yeah, that's interesting that you talk about it, the sensory aspect of it, that instead of it necessarily being a mental disorder, it really is a sensory disorder or issues. I had never heard that before. So that helps me with my perspective on what someone might be going through, because I mean, obviously we rely on our senses so much. And if your senses are, like you talked about being hyper aware or hyper alert with all your senses, I mean, that to me, that would be, I can't imagine what that must be like to live with that. So I certainly have empathy for people that are going through that. And yes, we did have 4th of July. So what if somebody is triggered? What would you recommend they do to help calm themselves?
Well, it's kind of interesting is in a lot of mental health and counseling type of therapies, people talk about deep breathing, which in the military is kind of an oxymoron, because when people talk about deep breathing from the counseling perspective, they talk about being able to calm yourself down. And a lot of times deep breathing is what someone that's been in combat arms, they deep breathe before they have to pull the trigger. So sometimes even deep breathing can be somewhat a trigger in itself.
Oh, wow. That's okay. That's
but you have to, I've always used what's called grounding. And so grounding technique, or we can call some people call it a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, which would be basically kind of just putting your feet flat on the floor, your hands on your knees, taking a couple of deep breaths, and then, all right now, because a lot of this is flashback oriented or even panic oriented. So what do you want to do to calm yourself down? All right, you want to bring yourself into the present. So the way you do that, what are 5 things I can see around this room right now? I see the lights, I see a clock, I see the computer, et cetera, et cetera. What are 4 things that I hear? I hear the buzzing of the lights. And really with the hearing, I think everyone kind of has something different for hearing. It takes so much effort for me to have to listen to something like, what are 4 things I hear in this room right now?
Right.
It forces me to have to be present.
Exactly.
What are 3 things I want to touch? What are some textures I want to like? Whether it be the seat that you're on, or your pants, or the chair, or the table. Is there something that textile in the room that you want to explore?
Okay.
Do you smell anything? Do you taste anything? So playing to those senses, which bring you, when you can focus on it, it brings you right back into having to be present. You're like, okay,
right.
I'm here now.
Right. And everything's okay.
I'm all right.
Right. I'm not in combat.
So,
and again, using your senses, but in a positive way, and a grounding.
So grounding is, I think, really, for me, and for what I teach a lot of the clients that I work with, grounding is one of the more effective tools when working with post-traumatic stress.
Yeah, that's great advice. I'm going to remember that.
It's good for anxiety.
I get anxiety sometimes.
So when you get stressed and anxious at work, it's really good for that as well. So
good. I'll keep that in mind.
Like have coffee around. I mean, coffee is really good because it's not only do you get to taste it and it's hot, so you have that feeling and sensory. But it's the smell of it as well. So coffee has a lot of essential pieces to it.
Oh, it does. So, even just holding the cup, and that's just that's my routine in the morning. I need that when I'm at my computer and just holding it and sipping it, and because I've tried to cut back on it, and it's just the whole experience. It's not just the coffee. It's just that whole experience. So yeah. Okay, that's great advice. So how do you, I mean, other than, like these techniques you just talked about, are there other ways you treat it, or are there new treatments out there right now?
Yeah, so I think one of the prevailing treatments for post-traumatic stress, or any trauma for that matter, is EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So you have to be trained in EMDR. It's not just any counselor can do it. It's a specialty training outside of the counseling degree.
And do you have that training?
I actually do not.
Oh, okay.
So I do work in trauma, but I work with solutions focused as well as cognitive processing and a couple others. I want to be EMDR trained. I just haven't been able to spend the time to do it yet.
Oh, okay.
Between military and state work and everything else. So
and what's the idea behind that? So
EMDR is basically similar to when you go to the doctor's office and they have you stare at the light and they have you. So what they use basically is your brain waves and being able to use cross-lateral movements and eye movement to desensitize basically as you're processing through that traumatic event, they're basically having you watch. Sometimes it might be their finger, and they'll be like, "All right, watch my finger as we process." But what happens is basically it forces the brain. So if you know much about brain science, we can go and it's a whole nother episode.
I'm sure.
But basically forces the right and left side brain to work together and to reset. So as you're processing, and they're having you do eye movement and they're doing cross-lateral movements, it's basically kind of forcing your right and left brain to have to reset and get back into a normal pattern. So as you're processing through that event, which allows you as the person with the experience of post-traumatic stress to be able to not just process it out and be able to talk about it, but it also is helping your brain kind of reset electrical flow and
frequencies,
frequency and everything.
Right. That's really fascinating. Actually,
EMDR is really impressive in how effective it is with post-traumatic stress and any trauma event. Another popular one that's been coming up and rising is what's called DBT, which is dialectical behavioral therapy. I don't know a whole lot about it. Haven't studied a whole lot of it myself. But then you have the ones that the military uses a lot of. One that I'm familiar with is cognitive processing, or what we call trauma-focused cognitive behavioral. So cognitive processing talks basically like how's your brain processing that event, to where trauma-focused cognitive behavioral is about how does your behavior and your thought process work together. So all different approaches. Again, EMDR is probably the leading one. It's the one that I would recommend, and it's one that I'll get trained in eventually when I have the ability to do so. But it's
is it quickly? Do you get results quickly from that, or
typically, yeah, you'll see results probably within the first 2 or 3 sessions, or you'll start to feel a little bit the results. Typically, it's about 12 session therapy. So. It can go longer than that, but for the most part, most of it's done within 8 to 12 sessions.
That's great. I would think that's pretty quick.
Yeah,
actually. Okay. All these initials treatments. PTSD. What'd you say? EMDR. Okay, and then the other one
DBT.
DBT.
Okay. CBT. CBT.
Oh gosh, I have to write all this down. Okay, well, so if PTSD is left untreated, how does that affect the quality of a veteran's life?
Well, I think it goes without saying, anytime that you're hypersensitive, your body, it's affecting you physically, it's affecting you emotionally. So anytime that you're hyper vigilant and hyper aware, you're always you're living at an increased level of adrenaline, cortisol running through your body. So you're at high blood pressure, hypertension, you're at higher risk for heart attack and stroke. You're at risk for a lot of different things when you start talking about hypertension and living with it for long periods of time. A lot of times it starts to manifest in an aggressive behavior because you get frustrated more easily. You're aggravated by a lot of things. So you live with anxiety and aggression a lot. And then also for others, like some will experience a lot more depression and isolation types. So you definitely want to be cautious. You definitely want to get it treated if you know you're having post-traumatic stress symptoms.
For sure.
And if you experience any kind of trauma, I would recommend. And this is you go through your master's degree in counseling. They always talk about before you go into counseling, go see a counselor and experience what it's like. So anybody, I'd recommend anybody that's ever experienced any kind of crisis or trauma, if you've never actually been able to process through that with somebody, go find someone that you trust. Go find whether it be a mental health professional, counselor, whether it be a friend or family member that you trust, or a pastoral care minister. Find somebody, but to be able to process those events with you.
Right. Because if you work with someone, you can usually process a lot faster than on your own.
And it's really difficult to process on your own.
Why is that?
Because I feel a lot of times you're going to want to isolate. You're like, you don't want I know for military, a lot of times military individuals don't want to talk about it because we don't want to traumatize somebody else. So we're like, I don't want you to know. It is sometimes a reflection of maybe we feel guilt and shame around maybe something that we've had to do or that we've done in the military. But other times it's just, I don't want to traumatize you with the things that I've seen and experienced. So a lot of times it's a protective factor, especially in the military. So they'll isolate and they'll try to stay away from people and try not to talk about those experiences. And you'll see that a lot with World War II, Vietnam, Korea War. And even with those, I would say even with Desert Storm and the Operation Iraqi. Excuse me, Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom. But you
And I'm
see that a
sure-
lot with World War II and Vietnam because this is a different era.
Well,
more
yeah.
private, more private.
I was going to say there's probably some stoicism there, or
Yeah.
just like, oh, just, bury it and go on and move forward. And a lot of men, especially men, have trouble expressing themselves or feel like it's, not the masculine thing to do, when really it's, it takes a lot of strength to do that.
Yeah, and when you go into the military setting, it's like pain is weakness leaving your body. So you're just kind of in that process, in that mentality of I should be able to be man and woman enough to deal with this, and I shouldn't have to bring other people into it. When really, it's like, what? It's a lot easier to process when you're just willing to. I'm proud of those that are willing to work on themselves and willing to bring in professional help to be able to work on themselves. It's always a step in the right direction.
Yes, doing some inner work. Now, can somebody have a traumatic event in their life, and I'm not even talking necessarily the military, and not know and not recall that event, but still be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms?
100%. And I think what you see, there's those that have gone through a traumatic event, especially if you've gone through some kind of like acute child crisis experience. A lot of times you'll block that memory out, or you'll try to block that memory out. But what's interesting is even when we don't remember the event, our body remembers the event. So a lot of times you may have had an experience as a child or in the military, and you've done everything you can to block that memory. And a lot of people are actually really good at blocking memories, and to the point that they may not have recollection of whole segments of their life because of it. So they'll live in this void, but their body, anytime again, like they might go to the mall or something like that, and all of a sudden, loud crowded space, or someone breezes their shoulder the wrong way, and their body responds. So even if you've tried to not process it, your body remembers.
And you don't even know why you're feeling that way or behaving.
There's
that
a
way.
really, really interesting book that's called "The Body Keeps the Score," that was put out by a doctor.
I've heard of that
a few years ago. That talks about how the body remembers, even when your brain has kind of pushed it aside and put it in the subconscious.
It stores it in the cells and just different.
So you can start bringing back through, again, EMDR or DBT and some of those therapy styles. They're really good about breaking down those walls and restoring that memory to be like, okay, now I can deal with what's right in front of me.
Right. Yeah, because I've read that memory is actually stored in your cells in your body and not necessarily the brain, like we think.
But yeah, I think it's both and. I think our body, with all the research and all the expertise that are out there, I don't think we even fully know and still understand how the body operates a lot of times. But what we do know is that your body will carry stress and will carry anxiety in places based off of your experiences.
Right.
And so there's a lot of research that's been done with how, if you live with a lot of anxiety, a lot of times you'll have stomach issues, and you'll have GERD and things like that.
Right.
And then if you live with high amounts of adrenaline and cortisol running through your body, and you have a lot of anxiety, then you're at a higher risk for heart attacks and strokes. So,
right, which is not good.
Yeah, it's all interconnected. That's why a holistic approach to healthcare, a holistic approach to mental health care is important.
I agree. I believe in that. That's my philosophy.
Yeah.
I'm all about holistic. All right. Well, so is there a hotline or anything that veterans or their loved ones can call if they're needing more information or they're having an episode of anxiety?
Yeah, so there's actually a couple. One of the more prominent ones for veteran specific is the Veteran Crisis Line. And the Veteran Crisis Line is 1-800-273-8255 and press 1. So it's actually connected to the Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So when you call 1-800-273-8255, don't freak out when you're like, hey, this is a suicide prevention hotline. Because if you press 1, it's the Veterans Crisis Line.
Oh, okay.
So it's a direct connect through that particular phone number. And then SAMHSA also has a national helpline. SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, if I get that right.
Right.
Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. They have a national helpline. That's 1-800-662-4357.
Okay.
And it's also another one that they can connect you with resources in your area. And then, of course, we have OK Valor here in Oklahoma. So if you're an Oklahoma resident and watching this, you can go to our website, which is oklahoma.gov/veterans. And then on the drop down, you'll see that there's suicide prevention services under Veteran Services, but we also have what's called OK Valor, which is a global information online system that you can really find any resource in your area by doing a radius search around your address or wherever your location is. And it pops up all pretty much social services that you may possibly need. So it's a good resource for mental health, healthcare, anything really social service oriented. So.
Okay, that's good to know. So there's plenty of resources out there, and there's no reason to suffer in silence.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for joining me today.
And yeah, thanks for having. I always love being able to talk about mental health, suicide prevention, post-traumatic stress, and how it affects veterans specifically. So.
Sure, and I know there's so much more we could talk about, so we'll have to do this again soon, and we'll take it further, a little bit further.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay, all right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. For more information, do visit our website at oklahoma.gov/veterans, and we will see you next time.